The shift log read 2347 when the east portal gate failed to cycle, and I noticed it because I notice everything on a dead shift. That's the job. That's the whole job when you're the only person awake for 11 miles in either direction. My name is Garrett Cole. I was the night operations supervisor for the Volo Tunnel on Route 93 in central Nevada. The tunnel runs 4.2 miles through the base of a mountain range that has no name anyone uses. We called it the Scratch Range because that's what the old BLM maps said, and nobody had ever bothered to change it. The facility had 3 of us on nights, me in the control room, a maintenance tech named Darnell Wicks who did the equipment rounds, and a woman named Sylvie Pruitt who handled the toll plaza on the east end. We weren't a busy tunnel. Maybe 80 vehicles on a quiet night, 200 on a weekend. Long-haul truckers mostly, a few locals. The occasional tourist who'd taken a wrong turn off the interstate looking for something that didn't exist out here. The east portal gate was a mechanical roll-up, steel and cable motorized, should have taken 45 seconds to cycle from closed to full open. At 2347, I sent the open command from the control panel and the gate went up 11 feet and stoped. Not jammed, not alarmed, just stoped. The current read normal on the panel. The motor wasn't pulling hard. The limit switch on the top rail wasn't triggered. The gate was simply sitting there, 11 feet up, which was 4 feet short of full open. I sent the close command. It came down clean. I sent the open command again. 11 feet. Stoped. I called Darnell on the radio. East portal gate is hanging at 11 feet, I said. Can you take a look? He said yeah, give me 8 minutes. I logged the call at 2349 and watched the camera feed. The east portal camera showed the gate frozen at 11 feet with the road running under it and out into the dark. A truck could pass under 11 feet if it wasn't too tall. Most trucks could. But it wasn't supposed to sit there and it wasn't supposed to stop short, and the part of me that had been doing this for 9 years didn't like the way it looked. The second thing was the radio. Not dead, not static, just a tone, a single low tone on the maintenance channel that I had never heard before, and that was not in any of the equipment manuals I had read. It wasn't an alarm tone. It wasn't a frequency bleed from another channel. It was something in the tunnel itself, I thought. Some interference from the ventilation stack or the emergency lighting array. I logged it and turned the channel gain down and it didn't go away. The third thing was Sylvie. Sylvie checked in every 30 minutes. 23:30 she had checked in and said the plaza was quiet, 1 truck through, she was making coffee. At midnight she didn't check in. I waited 4 minutes and called her. The plaza phone rang 8 times and went to the answering machine. I called her cell. It rang and rang. That was the first time I felt the cold that I am going to keep mentioning because it came back several times that night, and each time it was in a slightly different part of my body. The first time it was in my chest. I want to stop for a second before I go further. If you are watching this at night on your own, I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a place where you were responsible for other people and you felt something go wrong before you could name what it was? That feeling before the thought. The cold before the reason for the cold. Drop it in the comments if you know what I'm talking about. I read every one. Now. At 0:04 I called the District Operations Center in Ely. The line connected, rang twice, and clicked to a recording that said the center was closed and to call back during business hours. The District Operations Center was not supposed to close. It was a 24-hour facility. I had called it at 3 in the morning before and gotten a live person. The recording was new. I tried the emergency line. Busy signal. I sat for a moment looking at the control panel. 14 camera feeds, 8 of them inside the tunnel, 6 external. The tunnel cameras showed an empty tube of concrete and sodium light. The road surface wet from the drain leakage near the midpoint that had been a maintenance ticket for 6 weeks. The ventilation fans visible in the upper left of feed 7, turning slow. At 0:09 Darnell's voice came on the radio. Garrett. Yeah. I'm at the east portal. The gate looks fine from down here. Motor housing isn't hot, the cable is tracking straight, the limit arm is seated. I don't see anything wrong with it. Try the manual override, I said. He did. I watched the feed. The gate went up 2 more feet, stoped at 13, came down when he released the override. Doesn't want to go past 13 either, he said. I told him to stand by. I pulled up the archive on the gate cycle log. The gate had cycled 214 times in the previous 30 days. Every single cycle had stopped at full open, which was 15 feet 2 inches. I scrolled back 6 months. 1,847 cycles. All at full open, not one at 11 feet, not one at 13. Darnell, I said, has the gate ever stopped short before tonight? Not in 4 years, he said. I've been maintaining that thing for 4 years, never seen it stop short. Come back to the control room, I said. Why? Because I want you here and I want to try to reach Sylvie together. He came back. He was 41, Darnell, a compact guy with graying temples and the kind of unhurried manner you get from working maintenance in a place where there's no one to perform urgency for. He had a daughter named Kezia who was 9 and who had given him a friendship bracelet that he wore on his left wrist under his sleeve and pretended wasn't there when anyone mentioned it. He sat down across from the control panel and I told him about Sylvie. He picked up the console phone and called the toll plaza himself. 8 rings, answering machine. He looked at me. Her car in the lot, he said. I checked the east external camera. The staff parking was 2 vehicles, my truck and Darnell's truck. Sylvie drove a silver Subaru. I don't see her car, I said. Darnell looked at the screen for a moment. She might have parked on the apron, he said. She does that sometimes when she gets there early, parks on the road apron and then moves. I checked the apron camera. No silver Subaru. We sat with that for a moment. Her shift started at 2300 hours, I said. She checked in at 23:30. She was here at 23:30. Where'd she go? I don't know. At 0:17 a.m. truck came through the west portal, a white refrigerated semi, license plate from Utah. It came in at the posted limit of 45, and I watched it on camera 7, then 6, then 5, moving through the tunnel's sodium light, and it wasn't until camera 3 that something registered. The truck had slowed. Not braked, not stopped, just slowed, maybe 30 miles an hour in a 45 zone, a long truck drifting slow through an empty tunnel at midnight for no apparent reason. I keyed the tunnel PA. This is tunnel operations. Please maintain posted speed limit. The truck kept going at 30. I watched it on camera 2, then 1, then the east portal external feed. It reached the gate at 0:19 and I sent the open command and the gate went up 11 feet and stopped. The truck sat at the gate for 22 seconds. Then it backed up. Not turned, backed, straight back into the tunnel. I called the PA again. Driver in the eastbound lane, the exit portal is not fully cycled, but the clearance is sufficient for your vehicle. Please pull through. The truck backed up to camera 3 and stopped. Just sat there in the middle of the tunnel with its running lights on and the sodium lamps painting it orange. Darnell, I said, go out to the east portal and wave the truck through. The clearance is fine, the driver might not be able to tell from inside the cab. Darnell looked at the camera for a second. Why'd he back up, he said. I don't know. Maybe he can't judge the clearance from the cab. Darnell, I want to be honest with you about this moment. Darnell didn't want to go. I could tell. He picked up his radio and his jacket and he went, because that was the job and because he was the kind of man who did the job, but he looked at that camera for 1 extra second before he stood up. I watched him walk out on the external camera. He got to the east portal and stood in the road and waved both arms at the truck. The truck didn't move. He walked toward the gate, under the 11-foot opening, and into the tunnel. I watched him on camera 1 now, walking up the center line toward the truck's headlights, his reflective vest catching the sodium light. He got to about 50 feet from the truck's front bumper and stopped. He stood there. I keyed my radio. Darnell, what's the driver doing? He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was the same volume it always was, which was the thing about Darnell. He didn't raise his voice for things. He kept it level and you had to calibrate from the words, not the tone. Garrett, he said. I can't see the driver. What do you mean? The cab. The windows are dark. I can't see anyone in there. Engine running. Yeah, engine's running. Lights are on. I just can't see the driver. I looked at the camera feed. The truck was a white box with running lights and no movement, and from the overhead angle of camera 3, I couldn't see the cab either. Come back, I said. What? Come back to the control room. Don't approach the truck. Just come back. There was a pause. Yeah, he said. Okay. I watched him turn on camera 1. I watched him walk back toward the east portal on camera 1, and then I watched him disappear off the bottom edge of camera 1's field of view as he passed under the gate. He didn't appear on the external camera. I waited. He didn't appear. I called his radio. Darnell. Nothing. I called his cell. It rang once and went silent, not voicemail, just silence, like the call had connected and then the connection had simply stopped existing. I sat in the control room at 0:31 in the morning with 8 cameras showing me an empty lit tunnel and a white truck sitting in the middle of it with its lights on, and I could not see Sylvie and I could not see Darnell and I could not reach the district operations center and the east portal gate would not go past 11 feet. I want to stop here and tell you something before I go on. When I say I sat there, I don't mean I froze. I didn't freeze. I had a protocol. I knew the protocol. Emergency escalation, call the county sheriff's dispatch, initiate the tunnel incident procedure, document everything. I did all of those things. The county sheriff's dispatch answered. I told them I had 2 employees I couldn't locate, an unresponsive vehicle inside the tunnel, and a malfunctioning exit gate. The dispatcher took my information and said she was sending a unit. She said the ETA was approximately 40 minutes because the nearest unit was in Dollar Creek. 40 minutes. I said okay and I logged the call at 0:33 and I sat down and looked at the cameras. The truck had not moved. I pulled up the incident log and started typing, and while I was typing I noticed something about the tunnel cameras that I had not noticed before because I had been focused on the truck and on Darnell. The ventilation fans on camera 7. They weren't turning anymore. Not broken, not alarmed, just stopped. The same way the gate had stopped. The same way Darnell had stopped answering. The same way the operations center had simply not been there when I needed it. I looked at the environmental monitor on the panel. The CO sensor for the tunnel midpoint was reading normal. The NOx sensor was reading normal. Whatever had stopped the fans hadn't been triggered by air quality because the air quality was fine. The fans had just decided to stop. I typed all of this into the log. And then the tunnel lights went out. Not all of them. The emergency lighting stayed on, red and spaced and dim. The sodium lamps that had been painting everything orange went dark from the east end to the west in about 4 seconds, like something walking through the tunnel turning them off one by one. The truck's running lights were still on. I could see them on camera 3 in the emergency red, a white truck with orange running lights sitting in a red-lit tunnel like something I didn't have a word for. I checked the power panel. The main feed was live. The control room lights were on, the panel was lit, the cameras were running. It wasn't a power failure. The tunnel lighting circuit had simply gone off. I logged it at 0:41. At 0:44 the truck moved. Not forward, it didn't go toward the exit gate, it began to reverse, slowly, back toward the west portal, back the way it had come in. It moved at maybe 10 miles an hour in the emergency lighting, backing up the full 4.2 miles of the tunnel's length in the red dark. I watched it on camera 3, then 4, then 5, 6, 7, and then the west portal external camera. It came out the west end at 0:52, and it kept backing, out of the tunnel and onto the road, and I lost it when it went past the edge of the camera's range. I sat there. The tunnel was empty. The lights were still out inside. The fans were still stopped. The gate was still frozen at 11 feet on the east end. Darnell was still not answering. Sylvie was still not there. And somewhere on a Nevada highway in the dark, a white refrigerated truck from Utah was driving backwards, away from a tunnel it had gone into and then decided, for reasons I still do not fully understand, to leave. I am going to keep telling you this story. But I want to ask you something first. If you had been sitting in that control room at 0:52, with the cameras showing you an empty red-lit tunnel and 2 people you were responsible for somewhere inside or somewhere not inside, what would you have done? Would you have gone in? I made the choice I made. I'm still not entirely sure it was the right one. If you think you know what the right one was, I want to hear it. Tell me in the comments. Because I went in. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what I found in there. I am not a person who believes in things. I am a person who reads equipment manuals and logs anomalies and calls the district operations center. I have worked nights in isolated facilities for 11 years and I have never once felt that a place had an intention. Buildings don't have intentions. Tunnels don't have intentions. Infrastructure is infrastructure. I want you to know that about me before I tell you what the tunnel felt like when I walked into it. I took the emergency kit from under the console. Flashlight, radio, first aid pouch, the logbook I carried out of habit. I put on my vest and I keyed the PA one more time even though there was no one to hear it except maybe the tunnel itself. This is Operations Supervisor Garrett Cole. I am entering the east portal to check on personnel. If anyone can hear this, please respond. Nothing. The echo of my own voice coming back to me off 4 miles of concrete. I walked to the east portal at 0:57. The gate was still at 11 feet. I ducked under it without thinking about it, and the moment I was on the other side of it something changed about the air. I don't know how else to say it. On the outside the air was cold Nevada desert cold, dry and moving slightly from the west. On the inside the air was still. Not stale, not bad, just absolutely still. The way air is in a room where no one has opened a window or a door for a very long time. The emergency lighting was red and dim and spaced about 40 feet apart along the upper wall. Enough to see the road surface, enough to see maybe 30 feet ahead. Beyond that, dark. I turned the flashlight on and it helped and it didn't help. It showed me more road, more tunnel wall, the same wet patch near the midpoint drain that had been on the maintenance list for 6 weeks. The same yellow centerline running straight ahead until it bent very slightly to the left at the natural curve about a mile in. I called Darnell's name. The echo came back wrong. Not loud, not multiple. Just slightly delayed, like the tunnel was taking a half-second to decide whether to return my voice. Darnell. L. I walked. I want to tell you about the sound. A tunnel at normal operation is loud. The fans, the traffic, the ventilation stacks, the hum of the lighting ballasts. You stop noticing it after the first week, but it is always there. On the night of October 14th with the fans stopped and the sodium lamps off and no traffic and no one else inside, the tunnel was the quietest place I have ever been in my life. Quieter than the desert outside. Quieter than any room I have ever slept in. The only sound was my boots on the road surface and my own breathing, and the very faint drip of the drain leak at the midpoint which I would reach in about 2 miles. At camera position 1 I looked up at the housing. The red indicator light that tells you the camera is active was on. I was on the feed. Somewhere on the control panel my empty chair was looking at 14 screens and screen 1 was showing a man in a reflective vest pointing a flashlight at a camera housing. I kept walking. I want to ask you something. I keep asking you things and I'm going to keep doing it because this is the part of the story where I was alone and I have never fully decided whether I was thinking clearly or not. When you are the only person awake in a 4-mile tube of concrete under a mountain and 2 of your people are missing, do you think your mind is working right? Or do you think it is working in some modified version of right that is shaped by the silence and the red light and the way your own footsteps sound? Slightly wrong. I think about this. Drop something in the comments if you have an answer. At approximately camera position 2, which put me about half a mile inside the east portal, I found Darnell's radio. It was lying on the center line. Not dropped. Placed. The antenna was pointing east, toward where I had come from, and the radio was lying flat, not on its side the way it would land if you dropped it while walking. It was set down. Carefully. By someone who was paying attention to what they were doing. I picked it up. Keyed it. Darnell, this is Garrett. I found your radio. Please respond. The low tone I had heard from the control room came through the speaker. Just the tone. Steady. Not fluctuating. The same single low note I had logged at 23:58 and turned the gain down on and not been able to explain. I held the radio and stood on the center line and pointed my flashlight in both directions and there was nothing in either direction except tunnel. I put Darnell's radio in my vest pocket and kept walking. The midpoint drain was louder than I expected. In the silence of the tunnel the drip sounded like something deliberate, like a clock that someone had set and left running. Drip, and then a long pause, and then drip. I counted the pause once, 11 seconds between each drop. I don't know why I counted it. I logged it in the book out of habit. At the midpoint, I stopped. Not because of the drain, because of the smell. I mentioned at the beginning that tunnels have a smell, concrete and exhaust and the mineral cold of the mountain above you. On October 14th at approximately 1:15 in the morning, standing at the midpoint of the Volo tunnel with my flashlight pointing west, there was something else in that smell. Something warm. Not rot, not biological, not anything I would describe as bad. Just warm, like the smell of a room where someone has been sleeping, like the faint human warmth of an occupied space. The tunnel had been empty, according to every camera, since the truck had backed out at 0:52. I stood at the midpoint for a long time. Then I heard the sound. It was not a voice. I want to be specific about that because I have told this story before and people assume I am going to say I heard a voice and I didn't hear a voice. What I heard was a rhythm. A slow, even, regular rhythm from somewhere ahead of me to the west. A sound that my brain, before I had consciously decided anything, filed under the category of breathing. Not one breath. Not the rhythm of one person. Multiple. Overlapping. Slow. Like a room full of sleeping people. I stopped walking and turned the flashlight off. Standing in the red emergency lighting with the flashlight off, the sound was clearer. Still ahead of me, still west. Maybe 200 feet, maybe 300. It was hard to judge distance in a tunnel with no reference points and a sound that was soft and even and not getting louder or quieter as I stood there. I turned the flashlight back on and walked toward it. At camera position 5, I found them. Sylvie first. She was sitting against the tunnel wall on the left side, her legs straight out in front of her, her back against the concrete, her head tipped slightly forward. Her eyes were closed. Her toll plaza jacket was still on, her badge was still clipped to the front of it, her hands were in her lap. She looked like a person who had sat down against a wall and gone to sleep. I knelt down next to her and said her name and she didn't respond. I put 2 fingers on the side of her neck and found her pulse immediately. Slow and steady and strong. I lifted one of her eyelids and her pupil contracted to the flashlight beam, which meant her brain was responding to stimulus, which meant something was working. She wasn't cold, she wasn't in distress. She was breathing at the same slow, even rhythm I had been hearing. I stood up and moved the flashlight. Darnell was 8 feet further west, same position, back against the wall, legs out, head forward, eyes closed. I checked his pulse. Checked his pupils, same as Sylvie, breathing the same rhythm, pulse the same rate. On Darnell's left wrist, below his sleeve, the friendship bracelet Kezia had made him was still there. I stood up and moved the light further west. There were more of them. I counted as I walked, a man in a trucker's jacket with a Peterbilt logo on the chest, a woman in a gray sweater who looked maybe 60, who had a book in her lap that she was still holding with both hands even in whatever state this was. 2 more men I didn't recognize, a teenager in a green hoodie. 7 people total. Sylvie, Darnell, and 5 others I did not know. All sitting against the left wall. All in the same position. All breathing at the same slow rate. All alive by every check I could make in a tunnel with a flashlight and no medical training. I stood in the middle of the tunnel and pointed my light west and then east and I was alone in it except for 7 sleeping people and the drip of the drain at the midpoint and the low tone coming from Darnell's radio in my vest pocket. I want to be honest with you about what I felt. I did not feel afraid at that moment. I have thought about this a lot since and I think the reason I didn't feel afraid was that fear, the kind I was expecting, is for things that are hurting people. These people were not being hurt. They were sitting against a wall breathing slowly in a dark tunnel and none of them had a mark on them and all of them were alive. What I felt was something else, something I don't have a clean word for. It was the feeling of being in the presence of something that is operating on a logic you cannot access, like walking into a room mid-conversation and understanding that something important is being said and not being able to hear it. I knelt down next to Sylvie again. Sylvie, I said. Sylvie, it's Garrett, I need you to wake up. Her breathing didn't change. I put my hand on her shoulder and shook gently. Nothing. I shook harder. Her head moved with the shaking the way a sleeping person's head moves. Her body was loose and warm and entirely unresponsive. I stood up and tried Darnell. Same result. I tried the man in the Peterbilt jacket, who I did not know, and who I therefore felt strange shaking, and who also did not wake up. I stood in the middle of them and keyed my radio. This is Garrett Cole, Tunnel Operations Supervisor, Volo Tunnel Route 93. I have 7 individuals in an unresponsive state at approximately the tunnel midpoint. All appear to be breathing and showing pupillary response. I need medical response immediately. Please respond. The low tone came back through the speaker. Just the tone. I tried my cell phone. No signal. which was expected inside a concrete tunnel under a mountain, but which I had hoped might be different tonight by some logic I couldn't justify. I looked at the camera housing above me. Camera 5. The red indicator light was on. I was on the feed. Someone back at the control room, if there had been someone, would have been watching a man in a reflective vest standing in a red-lit tunnel next to 7 sleeping people, holding a radio, looking up at a camera. There was no one back at the control room. I thought about going back out to the control room to wait for the sheriff's deputy. The ETA had been 40 minutes from 0:33, which meant the deputy should have been there or close to there by now. If I went back out I could direct them in. I looked at the 7 people against the wall. I thought about leaving them. I couldn't do it. That's not heroic. I don't want you to take it that way. It was more that leaving felt like abandoning a logic I didn't understand, and I was afraid that if I broke the logic by leaving, something would change in a way I couldn't predict or undo. I sat down on the road surface facing them and put my back against the right wall, and I watched them breathe. The sound of it, 7 people breathing in the same slow rhythm in a red-lit tunnel. It was the most hypnotic thing I have ever heard in my life. I want to stop and tell you something before I go on. This is the part of the story that I have never entirely figured out how to tell. Because what happened next is either something that has an explanation I haven't found yet, or it is something that doesn't. I have been living with both possibilities for 3 years and I have not been able to close the door on either one. I am telling it the way it happened. I am not adding anything and I am not leaving anything out. What you do with it is yours. I watched them for approximately 10 minutes. And then I noticed that their breathing had changed. Not faster, not distressed, just synchronized, where before the rhythms had been overlapping, close but individual, now they were exactly the same. Every chest rising at the same moment, every chest falling at the same moment. 7 people breathing as one person, slow and even and perfectly timed. I counted the rate, 8 breaths per minute, which is slow for an awake person and normal for a deeply sleeping one. I logged it in the book. 134, 7 individuals, synchronized respiration, rate 8 per minute, no other change in presentation. I wrote it down because writing it down was the thing I knew how to do. At 1:41 the woman in the gray sweater opened her eyes. Not all the way, just a crack. The way a person opens their eyes when they are not quite ready to be awake but something has pulled them toward the surface. She looked at the ceiling. She didn't look at me. I said her name. I didn't know her name. I said ma'am, softly, the way you say it when you don't want to startle someone. She didn't react. Her eyes were open a crack, and she was looking at the ceiling of the tunnel, and her breathing was still in the same rhythm as the other 6 and she was not looking at me. I moved my flashlight toward her slowly. When the beam crossed her face her eyes closed again. Not flinched, not reacted to the light. Just closed. Smoothly and completely, the way eyes close when the thing that opened them is satisfied with what it saw. I turned the flashlight away. I sat there for a long time in the red emergency lighting with my back against the right wall and 7 people breathing in unison across from me, and a low tone coming from a radio in my vest pocket. At 1:58, I heard the footsteps. From the east. Someone coming from the east portal toward me. Boots on road surface, quick, 2 people, flashlights sweeping ahead of them. I stood up and called out and the flashlights swung toward me and one of them said police. Don't move. I said I'm the one who called. The beams dropped slightly. 2 of them, a man and a woman in brown sheriff's uniforms. The man may be 30, the woman may be 45, both of them stopping when their lights hit the 7 people against the wall. The woman said, "What in the hell?" I said I don't know. I said I found them like this. I said they're breathing. I said I can't wake them. The male deputy knelt next to Sylvie. He did exactly what I had done. Pulse, pupils. He looked up at his partner. "She's alive," he said. The woman deputy was already on her radio calling for medical. She gave the location and described the scene and the dispatcher on the other end went quiet for a second before asking her to repeat. She repeated it. 7 unresponsive individuals in a tunnel, no signs of trauma, vital signs present. I want to tell you about the male deputy's face when he stood up from checking Sylvie, because it was the same face I am sure I had been making for the past hour without knowing it. The face of a person who is applying known procedures to an unknown situation and doing fine on the procedures and not fine on the situation. He looked at me and said, "Sir, what happened here?" I said, "I don't know." I said, "I have been trying to figure that out for the last hour." He said, "Did you see anything?" I said, "I saw a truck." I said, "I want to show you the control room footage." He said, "Okay." He told his partner he was going to the control room with me, and she said, "Don't go far," and he said, "I won't." We walked back to the east portal, under the gate still frozen at 11 feet, out into the cold Nevada air. I breathed it in, the moving air, the desert cold, the absence of that still warmth that had been sitting in the tunnel since I walked in. The deputy breathed it too. I saw him do it. I saw him stand outside the gate for 1 extra second before he followed me to the control room, and I understood exactly what that extra second was. Inside, I pulled up the footage. We watched it together. The truck coming in at 2347, slowing at camera 3, backing up, sitting still, the lights going out, the truck reversing out the west portal. I showed him Darnell disappearing off the bottom of camera 1 and not appearing on the external. I showed him the gate stuck at 11 feet. He watched all of it without saying anything. Then he said, "Where did the people come from?" And that was the thing. That was the question I had not yet asked myself clearly enough. Because I had been focused on finding them and checking them and sitting with them, and I had not stopped to work backward. The truck had been the only vehicle to enter the tunnel that night. The cameras showed that clearly. 1 truck in, 1 truck back out. No cars, no vans, no other vehicles. 7 people sitting against a wall inside the tunnel. 7 people who had not, according to the cameras, walked in. I looked at the deputy. He looked at me. I said, "I don't know where they came from." He said, "That's not possible." I said, "I know." He looked at the screen for a long time. Then he said, "I need to call this in to my supervisor." And he stepped outside the control room door, and I heard him on the radio. And I sat in my chair and looked at the 14 camera feeds. The tunnel was empty except for the female deputy and the 7 unresponsive people. The female deputy was standing in the center of the tunnel facing west with her flashlight on. She wasn't moving. I keyed the PA. "Deputy, can you hear me?" She didn't turn toward the speaker. I keyed it again, louder. "Deputy." She turned her head slowly toward the camera. Her flashlight was still pointed west. She was looking at the camera housing with an expression I couldn't fully read at that resolution, but that looked, on the small monitor, very much like the expression of someone who is listening to something I couldn't hear. I stood up from the chair. And from outside the control room door, the male deputy stopped talking. I mean, he stopped mid-sentence. Not finished, not paused, stopped, the way a radio cuts out. I went to the door. He was standing outside with his radio to his mouth, and his eyes were closed. His breathing, when I watched his chest, was slow. 8 breaths per minute. I want to tell you what I did in the 30 seconds after I saw the deputy's chest moving at 8 breaths per minute. I did not go to him. I want to be clear about that because in the version of this story where I am a better person, I go to him immediately. I check his pulse, I call his name, I try to wake him the way I had tried to wake the others. I didn't do that. What I did was step back inside the control room and close the door. Not lock it. I'm not sure why I didn't lock it. Maybe because locking it felt like a declaration and I wasn't ready to declare anything yet. I just closed it and stood with my back against it and looked at the 14 camera feeds from across the room. The female deputy was still standing in the tunnel, still facing west, still not moving. The 7 people were still against the wall. The male deputy was outside the door behind me breathing at 8 breaths per minute with his radio to his mouth and his eyes closed. I stood there and I thought very carefully about what I knew. The tunnel had taken people. That was the word my brain used, and I didn't like it, but I couldn't find a better one. It had taken Sylvie at some point between 23:30 and midnight. It had taken Darnell at some point between 0:17 and 0:31. It had taken 5 others I couldn't account for, and now it had taken a sheriff's deputy who had been standing 12 feet outside the east portal. 12 feet outside. The gate was at 11 feet. I sat down in my chair and looked at that fact for a moment. The gate had stopped at 11 feet, which meant that anyone passing under it to enter the tunnel was inside the threshold, and anyone standing on the roadside of it, the way the deputy had been standing while he made his call, was outside. 12 feet. 1 foot past the gate. I got up and went to the door and opened it slowly. The deputy was exactly where he had been. Standing upright, eyes closed, radio to his mouth, breathing slow. I looked at the ground between us. The control room was set into the tunnel wall about 30 feet from the east portal. The portal opening, the gate, was visible from where I stood. I looked at the deputy's feet. He was standing just past the line where the road surface changed from the external asphalt to the tunnel's concrete. A change in surface that happened at almost exactly the point where the gate was hovering. I said his name. Deputy. Nothing. I said it louder. Deputy, can you hear me? His breathing didn't change. I went back inside and sat down and looked at the screens, and I wrote in the log at 2:14. Deputy non-responsive, position approximately 12 feet east of portal gate, presenting same as tunnel subjects, respiration slow and regular, standing upright. Standing upright. That was the thing I had not focused on enough. The others were all sitting, all against the wall, all in positions a person would choose if they sat down deliberately. The deputy was standing. He had gone under whatever this was while standing mid-sentence, and he had stayed standing, which meant it wasn't a loss of muscle tone. It wasn't unconsciousness the way a faint is unconsciousness. Whatever state this was, it preserved the body's last position. I thought about that. I thought about the woman in the gray sweater who was still holding her book. At 2:21, the ambulance appeared on the west external camera. Which was wrong. I had told the dispatcher the location was the Volo Tunnel on Route 93. The east portal was the one I had called from, the one with the control room, the one the sheriff's deputies had come through. The west portal was 4 miles away at the other end of a mountain. There was no reason for medical response to come to the west end unless they had been given wrong directions or had come from the wrong direction, or... I keyed the radio. This is Garrett Cole, Volo Tunnel Operations. I'm seeing an emergency vehicle at the west portal. Can someone confirm? The low tone. I picked up the console phone and called the dispatch number the deputy had been using. It rang 6 times and a man answered. I identified myself and told him I was seeing an ambulance at the west portal and that my people and the responding deputies were at the east end. He said he only had 1 unit dispatched and they were coming from Ely on Route 93 eastbound, which would bring them to the east portal. I said I'm looking at an ambulance on camera right now at the west portal. He went quiet for a second. He said that's not my unit. I looked at the camera. The ambulance was white with no markings I could read at that resolution. It was sitting at the west portal entrance with its lights off. Not running lights, not emergency lights. Just sitting there dark. I said, how long until your unit arrives? He said, 8 minutes. I said okay, and I logged the call and I looked at the unmarked ambulance sitting at the west portal in the dark, and I felt the cold move from my chest to my shoulders the way it had moved before and stay there. The ambulance did not move for 4 minutes. At 2:25 it turned on its headlights. Just the headlights, not the emergency lights, not the flashers. Just the regular white headlights pointing into the west portal opening. I watched it. At 2:27 it drove into the tunnel. Slow, the way the truck had driven, maybe 20 miles an hour on a 45 road, its headlights illuminating the tunnel in white instead of the emergency red, and I could see it clearly on cameras 7, 6, 5 as it moved east. At camera 5 it stopped. Next to the 7 people against the wall. Next to the female deputy who was still standing in the center of the tunnel not moving. I watched the ambulance sit there. Watched it on camera 5 for 40 seconds. And nobody got out. No door opened. No one appeared. It just sat next to 7 sleeping people in a red-lit tunnel with its white headlights on. At 2:29 the female deputy turned her head. She turned it toward the ambulance. Her eyes were open now. I could see it on camera 5 even at that resolution. She had opened her eyes and turned her head toward the ambulance, and she was looking at it the way you look at something you have been expecting. I keyed the PA. Deputy, this is Garrett Cole in the control room. There is an unidentified vehicle next to you. Please respond. She didn't respond. She took 1 step toward the ambulance. I said her name even though I didn't know her name. I said, ma'am, stop, do not approach the vehicle. She took another step. I watched her walk to the passenger side of the ambulance and put her hand on the door handle. I stood up from the chair. She opened the door and got in. The ambulance sat for 11 seconds after the door closed. I counted them, and then it began to reverse. Slowly, the way the truck had reversed, back west along the tunnel. Cameras 5, 6, 7, and then the west portal external. It came out the west end at 2:33 and its headlights went off the moment it cleared the portal and it drove west on Route 93 in the dark. I watched the rear of it until it left the camera range. No plates visible, or if there were plates they weren't lit and the camera resolution wasn't enough. I sat down. I stood up. I sat down again. I picked up the console phone and called the dispatcher back and told him what I had seen, and he was quiet for a very long time, and then he said his unit was 2 minutes out and he was going to call the state police, and he told me to stay on the line. I stayed on the line. I watched the east portal external camera. At 2:36 the sheriff's unit appeared. A marked cruiser, light bar going, pulling up to the gate. 2 deputies got out, and one of them was the dispatcher on the radio almost immediately, and I could see him talking into his shoulder mic, and looking at the gate frozen at 11 feet, and looking at his colleague standing in the road 8 feet inside the portal breathing slowly with his eyes closed. I told the dispatcher where I was, and the deputy with the radio looked up at the control room and saw me through the window, and I waved, and he said something into his radio, and the other one went to the sleeping deputy and knelt down. I opened the control room door. "Hey," I said. "There are more inside, there are 7 more inside." The deputy with the radio looked at me. He looked at his colleague checking the sleeping deputy. He looked at the gate at 11 feet. He said, "Sir, don't go back inside that tunnel." I said I won't. "I'm not going back in." He said good. He said stay right there. I stayed right there. The next 40 minutes were the organized chaos of emergency response arriving at something that emergency response does not have a protocol for. 2 more sheriff's units, a fire engine from the Dollar Creek Volunteer Station, and finally the county medical unit that had been dispatched from Ely came through in that order. The sleeping deputy was lifted and carried to the ambulance. He was still breathing at the same rate, still in the same position. They had to straighten his arm to get his radio away from his face. A paramedic went into the tunnel with 2 firefighters and a sheriff's deputy and came back out 6 minutes later and said there were 6 individuals against the wall and 1 law enforcement officer standing in the center of the tunnel, and all of them were breathing and none of them would wake up, and one of the firefighters had gone quiet about 4 minutes in and they had carried him back out. That made 9. The firefighter came out slack and breathing slow and got put in the ambulance next to the deputy. The incident commander, a state police sergeant named Holt who had arrived in an unmarked car at about 3:10, came and stood next to me and looked at the gate at 11 feet and at the tunnel beyond it and at the ambulance with 9 unconscious people in it. He said, "Walk me through it from the beginning." I walked him through it. I showed him the log, I showed him the timestamps, I told him about the truck, about the low tone, about the ambulance with no markings that had come in the west end and taken the deputy. He listened to all of it without expression. When I finished he said, "The ambulance." "Yes." He said, "Describe it again." I described it, white, no visible markings, no lights, 2 or 3 axle, standard ambulance profile. He looked at me for a moment. He said there was a vehicle matching that description reported abandoned on Route 93, west of the tunnel earlier that evening. He said it had been reported at 20:30 by a passing driver. He said the VIN came back to a medical transport company in California that had reported it stolen 3 weeks prior. I looked at him. He looked at me. He said, "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand that I am taking what you saw seriously." I said, "Okay." He said, "I'm also going to need you to understand that we cannot currently enter the tunnel to retrieve the remaining individuals." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because we keep losing people when we do." I said, "How many?" He said, "Not counting yours, we've sent 4 people in since we arrived." He said 2 of them came back out on their own after about 90 seconds and said they felt dizzy and disoriented and couldn't remember why they had gone in. He said the other 2 were currently in the ambulance. 11 people now. Plus whatever had happened to the 6 still against the wall inside. I looked at the gate frozen at 11 feet. "Sergeant Holt," I said. "Yes." The tunnel's ventilation fans stopped at approximately 0:41. The main lighting circuit went off at the same time. Those systems are controlled from this panel. He looked at the panel. I said I didn't turn them off. He said could they have gone off on their own? I said not both of them at the same time with no alarm and no fault code. He said could someone have accessed the system remotely? I said the system is not networked, it's a local panel only. There's no remote access. He looked at the panel for a long time. Then he said, what do you think is in there? It was the question I had been asking myself since 1 o'clock in the morning, and it was now 3:30, and I had not gotten any closer to an answer, and I told him that. I said I don't know what's in there. I said I don't think it's a person. I said I don't think it's a gas or a chemical because the sensors are reading clean and the people who came back out disoriented are all presenting normally now. He said, what do you think it is? I looked at the tunnel. I said I think the tunnel is doing it. He looked at me. I said I know how that sounds. He said it sounds like something I can't put in a report. I said I know. He said tell me what you mean by it. I said I mean that everything that has happened tonight has come from the tunnel's own systems. The gate stopping short, the fans going off, the lights going off. I said if someone was doing this they would need access to this panel and no one has been in this room except me. I said if it was a chemical it would show on the sensors. I said the only thing that makes sense to me, and I understand it doesn't make much sense, is that whatever is in there is coming from the structure itself. He looked at the panel. He looked at the gate. He said I need to make some calls. He went outside. I sat in my chair and looked at the 14 feeds. The 6 people were still against the wall. Camera 5 still showed them, small and still in the red emergency light, their chests moving in unison at the same slow rate. At 3:44 the tunnel lights came back on. All of them. The sodium lamps from east to west in about 4 seconds, the same direction they had gone off in. Like something walking back through the tunnel turning them on. At 3:51 the ventilation fans started. I watched them on camera 7. They came up slowly, not at full speed, like a motor warming from cold, and then they reached operating speed and the tunnel filled with a low mechanical hum that I had stopped noticing years ago and had been noticing the absence of for the last 3 hours. At 3:58 the gate cycled. I didn't send the command. I was sitting in my chair with my hands in my lap, and the gate cycled on its own, clean and smooth, all the way to 15 feet 2 inches, full open, the way it had cycled 1,847 times in the past 6 months without stopping short. I logged it. 3:58, East Portal Gate cycled to full open, no command sent from panel. I went to the door and called to Sergeant Holt. He came over and looked at the gate and at the panel and didn't say anything. At 4:03 Sylvie walked out of the tunnel. Just walked, through the gate, upright, her toll plaza jacket on, her badge clipped to the front, blinking in the external floodlights the way you blink when you've been somewhere dark and you've come back into the light. A paramedic went to her immediately and she let him take her arm and she looked around at the vehicles and the people and the lights and she said what happened. He said, "Ma'am, can you tell me your name?" She said, "Sylvie Pruitt." She said, "I work here." She said, "What is going on?" He said, "Do you know what time it is?" She said, "It's a little before midnight, isn't it?" It was 4:04 in the morning. She had lost 4 hours and had no memory of any of it. Over the next 20 minutes, the others came out. Darnell, then the 5 I didn't know, then the sheriff's deputies, then the 2 firefighters. All of them blinking in the floodlights, all of them believing it was earlier than it was, all of them unharmed by every measure the paramedics could apply at the scene. The last one out was the woman in the gray sweater. She was still holding her book. She came through the gate and looked around and a paramedic went to her and she said, "I'm fine, I'm perfectly fine, I just need to know where my car is." She had driven in from the west, apparently. She didn't remember stopping. Sergeant Holt stood next to me while the paramedics worked. He said, "I've been doing this for 19 years. I said, "Yeah." He said, "I don't have a word for this." I said, "I know." He said, "The state's going to want to send an engineering team." I said, "Okay." He said, "And a hazmat unit, even though you're right that the sensors are clean, they'll want to verify." I said, "Okay." He looked at the tunnel. He said, "It let them go," he said. I said, "Yeah." He said, "Why do you think it let them go?" I looked at the gate at full open, at 15 feet 2 inches, the way it was supposed to be. I looked at the sodium lamps burning orange through the full length of the tunnel. I looked at the fans turning on camera 7. I said I think it was done. He said done with what? I said I don't know. I said I've been trying to figure out the logic of who it took and it doesn't sort cleanly. It took Sylvie who was at the plaza and Darnell who went in after the truck and 5 strangers and 2 deputies and 2 firefighters. It didn't take me. It didn't take you. It didn't take the 2 deputies who came back out disoriented. He said, why not you? I said I don't know. I said I sat in there for almost an hour and nothing happened to me and I don't know why. He looked at me for a long time. He said, what did it feel like in there? I thought about it, honestly. I said it felt like being in a room where something important was happening that I wasn't part of. I said it felt like the tunnel was occupied. I said I know that's not a thing tunnels can be, but that's what it felt like. He nodded slowly. He said, go home, he said, we'll get your statement tomorrow. I said, what about my shift? He looked at me like I had said something from a different world. He said, I'll have someone cover it. I went home. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks after October 14th because I think you deserve the whole picture and not just the night itself. The state sent an engineering team on the 16th. 4 of them, structural and electrical, with a hazmat unit that spent 2 days taking air samples at 17 points through the tunnel. They found nothing in the air. Carbon dioxide at normal levels, oxygen at normal levels, no organic compounds, no particulates, no electrostatic anomaly, nothing that any instrument they brought could detect or categorize. The structural team inspected the gate mechanism for 3 hours and concluded that there was no mechanical reason it should have stopped at 11 feet. The limit switch was functional. The cable was undamaged, the motor was undamaged. They could find no explanation for why it had stopped short and no explanation for why it had cycled to full open at 3:58 without a command from the panel. They replaced the gate motor anyway. The electrical team went over the lighting circuit and the fan control system and found nothing wrong with either of them. They replaced the lighting ballasts as a precaution and installed a secondary control relay on the fan system that would theoretically prevent it from shutting down without an alarm. Theoretically. The report, which I read in full because Sergeant Holt sent me a copy, concluded that the events of October 14th were consistent with a series of unrelated equipment malfunctions occurring simultaneously, which the report acknowledged was statistically improbable but not impossible. The medical reports on the 11 affected individuals found nothing. No toxicology, no neurological abnormality, no shared exposure to any substance that could be identified. The report noted that all 11 individuals reported the same subjective experience, which was no experience at all. They remembered what they were doing before the tunnel and nothing after until they walked out the east portal. Sylvie told me she remembered making coffee at the plaza at 23:30 and then she was standing in floodlights and a paramedic was asking her name and it was 4:04 in the morning. Darnell told me he remembered walking toward the truck's headlights on camera 1 and then he was outside and it was almost dawn and Kezia's bracelet was still on his wrist and he was fine. The woman in the gray sweater, whose name was Patricia and who had been driving to visit her sister in Ely, told the state investigator that she had driven into the tunnel from the west and the next thing she knew she was standing in a parking area with a lot of lights and people asking her questions and she was still holding her book, which she had apparently not put down for the entire 4 hours she was unconscious. She told the investigator she thought she might have fallen asleep at the wheel and the investigator wrote that down and moved on. Nobody fell asleep at the wheel. I know that and Sergeant Holt knows that and I believe the state investigator knows that. But the report said equipment malfunction and mass hysterical episode potentially triggered by a localized infrasound event, and that was what it said and that was what it was going to say. I want to tell you about the infrasound theory because I think it deserves a fair hearing, even though I don't fully believe it. Infrasound is sound below the range of human hearing, below 20 Hz. Certain frequencies in that range can cause feelings of unease, disorientation, visual disturbances. There is documented research on this. The theory the investigators floated was that a specific resonance in the tunnel's ventilation system, possibly exacerbated by the mountain's geology, had produced an infrasound event that caused the affected individuals to lose consciousness. I said to the investigator, what about the gate stopping short? He said, equipment malfunction. I said, what about the lights going off? He said, same time as the fans, likely a shared circuit issue. I said, what about the ambulance? He got quiet. The ambulance was the thing the report couldn't close, the stolen vehicle from California, the recording on my camera of it entering the west portal and leaving with a deputy inside, and then, nothing. The vehicle was found 4 days later in a rest stop outside Tonopah, 60 miles west. Empty. No prints inside except the deputy's, and those matched his position in the passenger seat. No explanation for how it got there. The case was passed to the FBI, and as far as I know it has not been resolved. The deputy who had been inside it remembered nothing. He remembered standing outside the control room making his call, and then he was sitting in a parking lot in Tonopah at 6:30 in the morning with his radio still in his hand. 4 hours in a stolen ambulance with no memory and no explanation. The FBI agent who called me about it asked the same questions the state investigator had asked, and I gave him the same answers, and at the end he said, "Mr. Cole, do you have any idea why some individuals were affected and others were not?" I said no. He said, "You sat in the tunnel for almost an hour and you were not affected." I said, "That's correct." He said, "And Sergeant Holt stood outside for over an hour and was not affected." I said, "That's correct." He said the 2 deputies who came back out disoriented were not ultimately affected. I said, "Correct." He said, "What's the common factor?" I said, "I've been trying to figure that out for 2 weeks. He said, "So have we," he said. He said, "Call me if you think of anything." I said I would. I haven't called him. Not because I don't have a theory. Because the theory I have is not the kind of thing you call an FBI agent about. I want to tell you the theory. I want to tell you because I have been sitting with it for 3 years and I have not been able to disprove it, and I have not been able to confirm it, and I think it deserves to be said out loud, even if it sounds like the kind of thing you say when you have run out of better options. The people the tunnel took were all in transit. Every single one of them. Sylvie was working a shift that ended at 7 o'clock and going home after. Darnell was mid-route on his maintenance rounds. The 5 strangers were all driving through. None of them had a destination near the tunnel. All of them were passing through on their way to somewhere else. The deputies had been called in and were working toward an endpoint and then going home. The firefighters same. The people the tunnel didn't take were people who were already where they were going. I was in my control room. That was my place for the night. That was where I was supposed to be. Sergeant Holt arrived and set up his command post, and that was where he was. The 2 deputies who came back out had, both of them, been specifically told by Holt to stay outside the portal after they came back out, which meant their intended position was outside. Every person who was taken was moving through. Every person who wasn't taken was already there. I don't know what to do with that. I have thought about it from every angle I can find, and I don't know what it means about what the tunnel is or what it was doing or why it released them when it did. I don't know if it means anything at all or if I am the kind of person who builds patterns out of incomplete data, because incomplete data is all I have. I left the job in December of that year. Not because of what happened, or not only because of what happened. I had been thinking about leaving for a while, and after October 14th, the thinking became easier to finish. I live in a different state now. I work days. I drove through a long tunnel last year on a highway trip, and I felt my hands go tight on the wheel about 50 feet in, and I drove the full length of it at the posted speed with my hands tight, and I came out the other side and I kept driving. I'm fine. I want to be clear about that. I am fine. Sylvie is fine. I talked to her once after, about 2 months later, and she said she was back at work and the tunnel didn't bother her, and she thought about it sometimes at night, but mostly she was okay. Darnell transferred to a day position at a different facility. He told me his daughter had asked him why he was home for dinner now, and he had told her he changed jobs, and she had said good, and he had said yeah, it is. Patricia finished her drive to Ely. She told the investigator her sister made her a cup of tea, and she didn't mention the tunnel again that visit. All of them fine. All of them returned. All of them missing 4 hours they will never account for, and carrying something I don't have a name for that sits behind the eyes of a person who has been somewhere they can't describe and come back not quite knowing how. I want to ask you something before I go on to the last part of this. I have told you the theory about transit, about the common factor being movement, being in between, being on the way from one place to another. If that's right, if that's the logic the tunnel was operating on, what was it doing with them while it had them? What happens in the 4 hours? Because 11 people woke up with no memory and no mark and no explanation, and all of them fine. But all of them also quietly, in the ways they each described it to investigators and to me, different. Not traumatized, not distressed, just quieter. Sylvie told me on the phone that she didn't rush anymore. She said she used to rush, she was a rusher, she said, always running 5 minutes behind everywhere she went. She said after October she just didn't anymore. She said she didn't know why. Darnell went home to dinner. Patricia told her sister she was fine and drank her tea. The deputy who woke up in Tonopah, according to Sergeant Holt, who I talked to twice after, put in for a transfer to a desk position within the month. He said he was tired. He said he wanted to stop moving around so much. I want you to sit with that for a moment. I'm going to finish the story. There's one more part. One more thing that happened that I have not told anyone except Sergeant Holt, and Sergeant Holt told me to write it down somewhere and decide later whether to say it out loud. I'm deciding now. I want to tell you why I went back. It wasn't curiosity. I want to be clear about that because curiosity sounds manageable. Curiosity sounds like something a person does on purpose with their eyes open. What I felt in the 14 months between October 14th and the night I went back was not curiosity. It was more like an unfinished sentence. You know the feeling. When someone starts to tell you something and gets interrupted and the conversation moves on and you spend the rest of the evening waiting for them to finish and they never do. That feeling that sits in the back of your jaw like a word you can't quite get out. That's what it was. I had moved to Oregon by then. I was working a day position managing operations for a regional ferry terminal outside Portland. Water instead of stone, open sky instead of mountain, the smell of salt and diesel instead of concrete and mineral cold. I had a small apartment 15 minutes from the terminal, and I cooked my own meals and I slept reasonably well, and I was, by any measure anyone could apply from the outside, fine. But I had kept the log. The physical logbook I had been carrying the night of October 14th. The one I had written Darnell's radio position in, and the respiration rate, and the times. I had kept it in the drawer of my bedside table, and I had not opened it, and I had not thrown it away. And on the night of December 3rd of the following year, I opened it. I don't know why that night specifically. I had not had a bad day, I had not been thinking about the tunnel more than usual, I had not been drinking. I woke up at 2:30 for no reason and lay in the dark for a while, and then I got up and opened the drawer and took out the log and read it from the first entry to the last. 2347, East Portal Gate failure to cycle, stopped at 11 feet. 2349, called Darnell Wicks, maintenance, to inspect. 2358, low tone on maintenance channel, unidentified, logged and monitored. 004, Sylvie Pruitt failed to check in at scheduled midnight interval. All the way through to 403, Sylvie Pruitt exited East Portal ambulatory and responsive, believed time to be approximately 2350. I read it all, and at the end I sat on the edge of my bed and I thought about the unfinished sentence. And I thought about one specific thing that I had logged and then not returned to in any of the interviews or reports or conversations afterward. At 1:41, the woman in the gray sweater had opened her eyes. She had looked at the ceiling. When I moved my flashlight toward her face, her eyes had closed. I had been thinking about that as a response to the light. Eyes opening, light approaches, eyes close. Simple stimulus response, nothing remarkable. But sitting on the edge of my bed at 2:30 in Oregon 14 months later, reading my own handwriting, I thought about it differently. She hadn't flinched from the light. A person whose eyes are sensitive, a person who is in a light sleep and woken by a flashlight beam, flinches. The head moves, the face tightens, the body responds. She hadn't flinched. She had simply closed her eyes. Smoothly, completely, the way eyes close when the thing that opened them is satisfied with what it saw. I had written that in the log at the time. Satisfied with what it saw. I had not thought about whose satisfaction I was describing. I put the log back in the drawer and I lay down and I stared at the ceiling and I did not sleep again until almost 5 o'clock. In January, I drove to Nevada. I want to tell you that I had a reason, a practical, reasonable justification for being on Route 93 in central Nevada in January. I had a cousin in Las Vegas I had been meaning to visit, and the drive from Oregon to Las Vegas goes through Nevada, and Route 93 goes through Nevada. I could have taken I-15. I took Route 93. I reached the Valo tunnel at 23:20 on a Thursday night. I had timed it without admitting to myself that I was timing it. I pulled off at the scenic overlook a quarter-mile east of the portal and sat in my car with the engine running and the heat on and looked at the east portal from a distance. The gate was at full open, 15 feet 2 inches. The sodium lamps were burning orange inside. I could see the ventilation fans moving through the portal opening. Everything normal. One truck went through while I sat there. In the east portal, a minute and a half of nothing, out the west portal on the other side of the mountain. Normal transit, normal speed, normal time. I sat for 20 minutes. Then I got out of the car. I want to tell you that I had a plan. I did not have a plan. I had the logbook in my jacket pocket and a flashlight on my belt, and I walked to the east portal and I stood under the gate at full open and I looked into the tunnel. The sodium lamps burned all the way to the curve at a mile in, and then the light bent with the road and I couldn't see past it. The fans hummed. The air coming out of the portal was the tunnel's air, the still mineral cold I remembered, and underneath it, very faint, so faint that I told myself twice it wasn't there. The warmth. The occupied warmth. The sleeping room smell. The human warmth of a place where people are. I stood under the gate for a long time. A car came up behind me on Route 93 and slowed, and I stepped off the road, and it went past and into the tunnel at normal speed, and I watched its tail lights shrink to the curve and disappear. I stood there. I thought about Sylvie saying she didn't rush anymore. I thought about Darnell going home for dinner. I thought about Patricia holding her book. I thought about the unfinished sentence. And then I thought about the one question the FBI agent had asked that I hadn't been able to answer and had not been able to stop thinking about. What's the common factor? He had said. Why were some people taken and not others? Everyone in transit, yes. I had that theory and I still had it. But there was something else that I had noticed and filed and not spoken aloud. The people who were taken had all been alone. Sylvie at the plaza by herself. Darnell walking up the centerline toward the truck by himself. The 5 strangers all driving solo vehicles. The deputies had gone in together, but they had separated almost immediately inside, each going to different sides of the tunnel. The people who weren't taken had all been in contact with someone else at the moment it happened. I had been on the radio with Darnell when he went under. Holt had been on the radio with his dispatcher when his deputy went under outside the door. The 2 deputies who came back out had come back out together, and neither of them had been taken. Alone, and in transit. That was the complete condition. Both had to be true. I thought about myself walking into the tunnel at 0:57 alone and in transit, moving through, going somewhere, and nothing happening to me. And the reason nothing happened to me was the one thing I had done differently from everyone else. I had sat down. I had sat down on the road surface against the right wall, and I had watched the 7 people breathe, and I had stopped moving through and simply been there. I had arrived. In a tunnel with no destination, with no exit I was heading toward. I had sat down in the middle of it and been present in it, and the tunnel had left me alone. I stood under the east portal gate in January at 23:40 at night, and I understood something that I could not prove and could not report and could not explain to anyone who had not been in that tunnel on October 14th. The tunnel was not malicious. It was not hunting. It was not trapping. It was not doing something to the people it took in any way that I could characterize as harm, because they all came back, all of them came back without a mark. And whatever it had done with them in the 4 hours it had them, it had done gently enough that they slept through it and woke up quiet. I think the tunnel was lonely. I know how that sounds. I know what you're doing with your face right now because I know what I did with my face when the thought first formed clearly enough to be a thought. A 4-mile tube of concrete under an unnamed mountain range in central Nevada, lonely. But I have sat with it for 3 years and I have not found a better word. It took people who were passing through and would never come back. People who were in between, who were on their way from one place to another, and for whom this tunnel was nothing, was a means, was a dark stretch of road to get through and forget. And it kept them for 4 hours and then it let them go. And the people it let go came back quieter. Less in a hurry. More willing to arrive somewhere and stay there. I don't know what happened in the 4 hours. I don't know what the tunnel did or showed them or gave them or took from them. I don't know if the warmth I smelled was them, their collected human warmth filling the space, or something else, something the tunnel itself put into the air around them. I don't know about the ambulance. That is the part that doesn't fit my theory cleanly, and I know it and I've sat with it. A stolen vehicle entering from the wrong end and taking one specific person and leaving. That part one cannot make peaceful, and I have stopped trying. But I stood under the gate in January, and I made a decision. I walked in. Not far. 20 feet past the portal. Far enough to be inside, far enough to be under the mountain, far enough that the external air was behind me and the tunnel's still warmth was around me. I stopped. I stood there. And I said, out loud, to a tunnel, to concrete and sodium light and ventilation fans and whatever else was in there that I couldn't name. I said I'm not passing through. I said I came back. I said I know that's strange. I said I know I can't explain it, and I know you can't answer me, and I know I sound like a man who has been alone with something for too long and started talking to it. I said I just wanted to come back. I said I wanted to finish the thing that felt unfinished. I stood there for a long time. The fans hummed. The sodium lamps burned orange all the way to the curve. The warmth was there. Faint, underneath everything, the occupied warmth. And then it wasn't. Not gone dramatically, not switched off, just faded, the way a smell fades when you've been in a room long enough that your nose stops registering it. Slowly and completely until the air in the tunnel was just tunnel air, mineral cold and concrete and the faint exhaust residue of 40 years of transit. I stood there a little longer. Then I walked back out under the gate and to my car and I sat in the driver's seat with the heat running and I looked at the portal. Normal, gate at full open, fans turning, sodium lamps orange. A truck went through while I sat there. In the east portal, normal speed, out the west end a minute and a half later. I started the car and I drove south toward Las Vegas. I visited my cousin for 4 days and I drove home on I-15. I have not been back since. I want to tell you the last thing. The thing I have been building toward and have been not quite saying for this entire story. When I walked back out of the tunnel that January night and sat in my car, I sat there for a while before I started driving. And in that while I opened the logbook to the last page I had written on, the 403 entry, Sylvie walking out. And I wrote one more entry. January 9th. 2347, returned to East Portal, Volo Tunnel, Route 93, Nevada. Entered 20 feet. Stood, not in transit, not alone, present. I wrote that last word and then I sat with the pen on the page for a moment. And underneath it, I wrote. I think it heard me. I don't know if that's true. I don't know if anything I have told you tonight is the right explanation for what happened or if there is a right explanation or if the right explanation is the dull one, the infrasound and the equipment malfunction and the mass hysterical episode, and everything I have layered on top of that is a man making meaning out of the dark because the dark is easier to live with if it means something. I don't know. What I know is this. 11 people went into a tunnel and came back changed in small quiet ways. Came back less hurried, less in between, more willing to stop moving and be somewhere. And I sat in a tunnel for an hour alone and came out the same but different in a way I have never fully described to anyone and am describing now for the first time. Less interested in passing through. More interested in arriving. I work days now. I told you that. I work a day position at a ferry terminal and I cook my own food and I sleep reasonably well and I have a chair on a small balcony that faces west and on the evenings I'm not too tired I sit in it and watch the light go off the water. I don't rush. I used to rush. I was always running 5 minutes behind everywhere I went. Always in transit. Always between one thing and the next. I don't do that anymore. I don't know when that changed. I have an idea about when it changed. If you have stayed with me to the end of this, thank you. Genuinely. You would be surprised how much it matters, sitting in a room telling a story, to feel like someone on the other side is still there. If you've been somewhere you can't explain, if you've come out of something quieter than you went in, if you know the feeling of a place that felt like it had an intention even though places don't have intentions, tell me. I read every one. The tunnel is still there. Route 93, Central Nevada, 4.2 miles through a mountain range the maps call Scratch. The gate cycles clean to 15 feet 2 inches. The fans turn. The sodium lamps burn orange from east to west. Some nights I imagine it empty and lit and humming to itself under the mountain, waiting for no one in particular. Patient the way stone is patient. The way something is patient when it has been there long enough that it has stopped counting the time. I imagine the warmth in the air. The occupied warmth. And I think about all the people who drove through it today without stopping. All the long-haul trucks and the tourists who took the wrong turn and the locals who have done that stretch so many times they don't see it anymore. All of them passing through, all of them in between, all of them on their way to somewhere else. And I think about the tunnel noticing. And I think about what it is to be a place that people pass through their entire existence without ever arriving in. And I think, I don't know. I think that might be the saddest thing I know. That was the crossing.